And it is time to go live. Greetings, everybody. I am RJ Carter, your host for tonight, Senior Managing Editor here at criticalblast.com. And we've been having some fun, some success with these open mic nights. So we decided we'd throw another one out here tonight since we didn't have a scheduled guest. Uh, and I thought I would do the same thing I did a couple of nights ago, where I would just start the show off reading from something that is already available from Critical Blast Publishing. This would be an anthology of short stories called Strange Imaginings. It's available on Amazon. This is one of the earliest things we've got. I wrote the short stories in this one, so it's a bit self-serving, but I'd rather read something I wrote than something somebody else wrote and do a disservice to them. And tonight is sort of a push night. We are at 970 something subscribers. We are trying to get to that 1,000 mark, that magical 1,000 mark. So if you would please share the stream, hit the subscribe button if you haven't hit it already, and we will greatly appreciate that. We've worked very hard all the past couple of years to get as far as we have, and we could not have done it without all the people who keep coming back to see what those crazy guys are going to do next time, which is what we excel at, is crazy things. So this is a story called The Top Secret U.S. Military Extraction Effort of Oz. And this was originally written for an anthology called I Should Have Stayed in Oz from Yard Dog Press, which was all going to be stories about Dorothy after the Oz visit. I ended up putting it here because it was too long for the anthology. Once I finally got it done, I was like, well, it tells everything that has to be done. I don't anticipate reading all of it tonight. As soon as somebody pops in, it's definitely no longer about me and all about you. So, I'll keep an eye on the chat stream. If you see my head turn this way, I'm looking at the laptop where the chats will show up and where visitors will show up. The door to the studio is open. Anybody can wander in. The link is out there on Twitter. If you want to come in and talk about your project, you want to come in and talk comics or current events, the door's open. Come on in. We're friendly here. So, the top secret U.S. military extraction effort of Oz. Join the Navy, see the world, the recruitment poster had promised, with its portrait of a smiling young woman in a crisp white uniform saluting the onlooker. The Navy and the Marines had jointly announced they were expanding their ranks by allowing women to enlist, for non-combat duties, of course. To a farm girl who had spent her whole life on a tiny square of bleached earth engulfed by acres of wheat, a colorless island in an unbroken sea of gold, the offer sounded too good to be true. That's what Uncle Henry would have said about it if he'd still been alive. That was months ago. Now Yeoman Gale stood on the deck of the USS Baum, itself a steel gray moat afloat in the clear blue of the South Pacific. And those days on the Kansas farm were someone else's life. She gripped the railing and breathed in the salt spray, getting used to the notion of feeling warm breezes in early February. Back home, one could still get blizzards this time of year. So what is it that a yeomanette does at sea? Dorothy didn't have to turn to see who spoke. She'd gotten used to the barbs and innuendo from many of the crew, particularly the smarmy come-ons from Master Gunnery Sergeant Harrington, a self-professed Marines Marine, who believed rank had certain privileges, among them being the right to assert undue familiarity on female service members, since the military deemed fit to force them upon him. Men like Harrington were why Dorothy didn't go topside often, preferring to stay in quarters. So what's a girl do to win a South Seas cruise in this man's Navy, he said, sidling up to her against the railing. Raise the old man's topsail? Polish his mizzenmast? While making no overt moves against her, he positioned himself squarely between Dorothy and a quick exit like a natural predator. Others among the crew might let fly with a whoop or a wolf whistle. This may have been the new Navy, Dorothy had been warned, but these were still the old sea dogs. But Harrington was a more dangerous species. You can tell me, he said with a wink, or, show me if it's too delicate for a lady to put into words. Of course, not only was Harrington not yet cleared to know why Dorothy was on board, he also wasn't cleared to know he wasn't cleared. If she told him it's top secret, he'd probably take it as flirting. I'm on storm watch, Gunnery Sergeant Harrington, she said, turning her eyes coldly to the placid horizon. Storm watch, eh? Harrington chuckled. If you want your boat rocked, honey, there are other ways to get that done. Besides, there ain't a cloud in the sky for miles. No, she said. No, there's not. And we could really use a good, strong shipwrecking storm right now. With that, she stepped around the puzzled Gunny and walked the deck back toward the bridge, leaving him muttering something about dames while he ogled her departing hips. She was nearing the bridge when Master Chief Petty Officer Darling stepped around the corner. Darling could have been a poster model for Navy recruitment himself, and it still would have been one women would have responded to. More so, perhaps. He was tall and athletic, with a ready smile balanced by steely eyes. Of the few who knew of Dorothy's true purpose aboard the bomb, she liked him best. In addition to his understanding of the urgency of their bizarre mission, he had shown a quick acceptance of Dorothy's story. Of course, the recent announcements from both Germany and Great Britain went a long way toward lending credence to her confession. Where others at her hearing had gaped with incredulity, Darling exuded a boyish optimism almost immediately. He later told her in confidence that her story had given him a hope, a new star to follow, as he put it, if they were going to combat the Kaiser's arcane forces. Yeoman Gale, he said curtly, how's the weather? Disappointingly clear, Chief, she replied. I'm afraid it's smooth sailing. You're certain we need a storm? He asked with concern. There's no other way to navigate to this land of Oz? I'm certain of little, Chief, she said. I only know it's got to be safer and more reliable than throwing oneself into a Kansas cyclone or a California fissure. She hadn't told Darling or anyone else that the easiest way to Oz had long since ceased to work. Her secret signal to Princess Ozma, who had promised to magically look in on Dorothy every Saturday for just such a signal. Ozma would use the Gnome King's magic belt to wish Dorothy to Oz, but Ozma stopped responding to the call years ago. She looked out at the blue Pacific expanse. Uncle Henry and I sailed through here when I was a girl, she said. We were going to Australia when the storm hit. I was thrown overboard and washed up on the shores of Ev. It's the only non-magical way I know of getting to Oz. And Ev is one of Oz's provinces? Darling asked. A neighboring country, said Dorothy. Oz itself is landlocked. Ev doesn't really border Oz, though. It's to the northeast, with both countries separated by the impassable desert. And we have to go through both to get to the Gillikin country in Oz. Darling's eyes took on a faraway look. Such exciting new geography, he said. I'd give my right arm to have adventures in places like that. The world's apparently a bigger place than we ever thought, she said. When hasn't it been? Said Darling. His focus came back to the present. Well, chin up, Gale. We've got time. He patted the railing of the boat like it was an old friend. Who knows? We may wreck this old gal yet. 10 days and an indeterminable number of circles of the same quadrant of ocean later, a line of dark clouds appeared on the horizon. As she anticipated, Captain Pevensey called in Dorothy and the others to assess overall strategy yet one more time. The captain's ready room was small, and only a few men and one woman sat around the table, leafing through notes taken over the course of the past few months. Captain Pevensey was already well into the same speech he had given before about reconnaissance of Ev upon arrival. Sir, said Dorothy, I just want to emphasize that we shouldn't assume the storm will necessarily drive us to Ev. In fact, it's more likely to capsize the ship than navigate it. Pevensey was unperturbed. We're going to Ev, yeoman, he said emphatically. I have every faith in that fact, and expecting nothing save success. With that, he launched back into covering plans and countermeasures with the officers attending. Across the table, Master Chief Darling caught her eye. Don't doubt yourself so much, Gale, he said. Think of it as an opportunity for adventure. In the distance, Dorothy heard the first rumblings of thunder. As the bomb listed in the shallows of the Nonesti Ocean, Captain Pevensey decided it was time to brief the rest of the crew about the true nature of their mission. It went much the way Dorothy expected when she had first brought her story to her own commanding officers, only on a larger scale. Disbelief from some, but a mounting acceptance from the others who had already come to accept such impossibilities in the face of the German and British exposures. The crew would remain with the bomb, making repairs and maintaining a defensive posture, while a platoon of Marines would disembark, whereupon they would be given the finer details of their objectives. Gunnery Sergeant Harrington didn't care for it at all, and didn't care who overheard him grousing with his men during mess. Anyone figured out how many hundreds of thousands of dollars the Navy's wasting chasing down some sailorette's bedtime story? He complained. I'll tell you how many. Too damn many. That's how many. I don't know, Gunny, one of his men said, tremulously. Admiral Little must have bought it to put so much manpower on it. Harrington spat. The old man's been half-cracked for years, and everyone's too afraid to admit it. The senile old fool would believe 8 impossible things before he's even had breakfast, and the brass would still call him a visionary. Oz. Mark my words, boys. We're either off New Guinea or one of the Philippines. There ain't no Oz. But what about those German dames, Gunny? Another asked. If there's such a thing like they got, there's a logical explanation for everything, Harrington said. What the Germans got is just something we ain't figured out yet, not some fairy tale hoodoo. And what the Limeys got ain't much anyway. He pushed away from the table. The day I start to believe in wicked witches and talking animals in a magical land of Oz will be the day monkeys fly out my butt. Ashore, Dorothy stood with Captain Pevensey, Master Chief Darling, and Gunnery Sergeant Harrington around a makeshift table, going over the map of Oz Dorothy had drawn from memory. She looked out toward the Nanistic Ocean, then up and down the coastline. This thing's all cockeyed, Yeomanette, said Harrington. Look at this compass rose. You've got your east in the west and your west in the east. That's Glinda's spell, Gunnery Sergeant, said Dorothy. He rolled his eyes. It confuses outsiders and prevents them from finding their way to the Emerald City. Captain, I'm almost certain we've come ashore in the land of Ev. This looks like the deep canyon just north of here. You're sure it's not south of here? Muttered Harrington. Pevensey double-checked the landmarks against the map. That jives with the 2 islands we passed, he said, pointing out toward the ocean in a vaguely northeast or northwest direction. What about the whalers you spoke of? Asked Darling. Shouldn't we be on guard for them? Aye, Chief, said Dorothy. Although they ought to leave us be. They're loyal to King Evardo 15th, and he's a friend. Whose friend? Asked Harrington. Yours or ours? He continued to shake his head while studying the map. Are we seriously supposed to be afraid of something called whimsies? He said to himself. Captain Pevensey tapped the center of the map, indicating the Emerald City itself. Can this Evardo help us get to here? He asked. I'm afraid not, Captain, said Dorothy. Much as I'd love to see him again, the royal family of Ev has no means to cross the impassable desert. We need to go south, and carefully. If we're lucky, King Calico still sits on the throne, and will be in a receptive mood. I thought you said this Eduardo guy was king, said Harrington. Of Ev, yes, said Dorothy. Calico is the Gnome King, and we need to pass through his dominions if we want to have any chance of getting into Oz. They marched south for much of the morning. These directions are all screwy, muttered Harrington. We've got to be bearing north. He tapped his compass, which insisted they were marching in a southward direction, despite the sun traveling eastward across the sky. Behind them, the younger Marines occasionally spotted bizarre varieties of wildlife in the rocks, but no birds. I swear that rock moved, said one. Moved hell, his friend replied. Either we're going in circles or those boulders are following us. Indeed, the rock gnomes had been aware of the Marines' presence since they first set foot across the border of the dominions of the Gnome King, and had been shadowing them as they made their way through the foothills. Their number had been slowly amassing as the other rock gnomes joined them. Dorothy had seen them right away, and had discreetly made Darling aware of them. Shooting them won't hurt them, she said, as she watched them with wonder. If we need to fight them, we've some eggs, but let's hope it doesn't come to that until after we've got what we want. Within the hour, so many gnomes were following that it seemed there was a veritable rock wall perpetually a half-mile behind the platoon. The men were getting more and more unnerved, but kept in formation until the barren ground gave rise to a doorway carved into the side of a large outcropping of stone. The 2 boulders on either side of the entrance stood, their features now made clear to everyone. Harrington readied his rifle, and the rest of the platoon followed his lead. Halt, the gnomes said in unison with a voice like an avalanche. State your business. Captain Pevensey stepped forward. I am Captain Clive Eustace Pevensey of the United States Navy, he said with authority. We would speak with your leader, King Calico. The rock gnomes looked at each other, then chuckled deeply. King Calico has no business with your country, nor wants any. Go home quickly before we slice you up and feed you to the 7-headed dogs. Pevensey stood his ground, and Dorothy stepped forward. Permission to pull rank on you, Captain, she asked. Pull, he started, then nodded his assent. Dorothy addressed the gnomes. She stood tall and thrust out her chin. I am Dorothy, a princess of Oz. Calico knows me, as Roquat knew me before him, before we threw him away. She let her meaning sink in. Calico will speak with me. The gnomes weighed Dorothy's words. One turned and entered the doorway, leaving the other to block it. I didn't see any weapons on either of them, whispered Harrington. For God's sake, Gunny, look at the size of him, said Darling, his eyes on the remaining guard. He is a weapon. After several minutes, the second guard returned. King Calico extends his invitation to the little upstairs people, he said. You may enter. 4 Marines stepped forward to take point, but Dorothy made sure to stay 2 steps ahead. It has to be me who goes first, she said. Calico will perceive anything else as a sign of weakness. And so, with Yeoman Gale at the lead, followed by 4 armed Marines, Captain Pevensey, Master Chief Darling, and Gunnery Sergeant Harrington, leading the rest of the rifle platoon, they marched through the entrance, through caverns chiseled from the earth, deep into the underground palace of Calico, the Gnome King. Roquat's former steward was much changed, and not necessarily for the better. He was much fatter and messier. Crumbs from some previous meal speckled his beard. Furthermore, his demeanor was no longer that of the fastidious forward thinker who had always been 3 thinks ahead of his master. He scowled regularly now, and a vein stood out prominently on his forehead, where the crown sat at a careless tilt as he lounged on the throne. Indeed, he looked very much like Roquat himself, and had Dorothy not known better, she might have mistaken one for the other. Greetings, Dorothy of Kansas, Princess of Oz and the Emerald City, he said as they entered the platoon, spreading wide behind Dorothy as she approached. If their presence perturbed Calico in the slightest, he didn't show it. While his words were diplomatic enough, his scowl was unaltered. It had likely become his permanent expression. What brings you to my domain, and with such an odd retinue of upstairs people? Dorothy curtsied lightly. Greetings, Calico, King of the Gnomes, Master of the Mountain, Ruler of Rock, Captain of the Crust, greatest among Phanphasms, Whimsies, and Growlywogs. Dorothy paused, watching Calico for a sign that she had left out any titles from the formal royal greeting. Seeing none, she continued. My friends and I seek your leave to access the great tunnel of Roquat. Calico stared, unmoved. Because? He prompted her. It is a military inspection, Dorothy said, delivering the cover story they had worked out. A verification that the gnomes still abide by the terms of the treaty after Roquat's attempted invasion of Emerald City. A crack appeared in the dust on Calico's cheek, and Dorothy realized it was caused by Calico struggling to smile. The tunnel is more choked with dust today than when Ozma first filled it years ago, said Calico. Why does the ruling House of Oz choose to mistrust me after all this time? I should take great affront to the suggestions of disloyalty. Dorothy took a breath and tried to speak evenly. I assure the great Gnome King the inspection is merely a formality. However, should the Gnome King wish to deny access, it would be assumed the great Calico had something to hide, which would greatly displease Princess Ozma, who even now stands prepared to use Roquat's belt to wish upon the Gnome King's dominion an invasion of chickens, turning the whole of the domain into an egg factory. All I have to do, she held up her navy dog tags, is shake the enchanted charms to alarm Ozma of your decision. The rock gnomes assembled in Calico's great hall shifted uncomfortably, grumbling, for as everyone knows, eggs are poisonous to gnomes. Calico, however, was unimpressed and said nothing until the hall grew silent again. No, he said finally. No, I don't think Ozma will do any such thing. I think instead you are trying to get to Oz yourself through the tunnel, and that Ozma knows nothing about it. He clapped his hands twice, and his guards advanced. Escort Princess Dorothy and her contingent to the tunnel, he said. Give them every courtesy and protection. As they prepared to follow, Calico spoke once more. You have learned guile, Dorothy of Kansas. I think that bodes not well for the Emerald City. Now he truly did smile, and it was a smile that was once Roquat's own. I think I shall look forward to the consequences of your arrival. As they exited the chamber and made their way down twisty stone halls, Dorothy could hear the raucous cackle of the Gnome King trailing behind them. Was anybody ever going to mention the Sailorette as a goddamn foreign princess? She got us through the tunnel without incident, said Darling. You ought to be glad of that. Harrington fumed. I've got a platoon of Marines with machine guns to be glad about, he said. That's That stone body armor these Nomians wear looks tough, but it ain't nothing a few rounds of shells wouldn't bust through. And that still doesn't change the fact that we've got a goddamn foreign dignitary of some soft sort serving him. Ugh, that's fun to say. And that still doesn't change the fact that we've got a goddamn foreign dignitary of some sort serving in the goddamn U.S. Navy. A yeomanette who's apparently leading this mission in a foreign theater, issuing orders to superior officers. Tell me what's not wrong with this. Yeoman Gale didn't have to tell us about any of this, Gunny, Darling said coldly. In fact, she took a terrible risk in bringing it up in the first place. Given what's happening on the European front and what we've seen ourselves so far, I'd say she's more than earned some measure of trust. Admiral Little was fully briefed as to Yeoman Gale's stature among the Ozites, as was I, added Captain Pevensey, speaking low enough so only the two could hear him. No one else had a need to know. Now, if you ladies are done undermining the morale of the troops with your petty bickering, I'm guessing that's our tunnel coming up. The hallway opened up into a large antechamber, on the far side of which was a pair of wooden doors, 3 times as tall as any of them. It had all the appearances of a sealed-up mine shaft, and it was only with considerable effort that the gnome guards were able to pull the doors apart. From the gaping hole behind the doors, a great cloud of dust emerged, causing all present to cough before it settled to the floor. "Masks!" yelled Harrington. As the soldiers took the gas masks from their kits, Captain Pevington took Harrington aside. "A word, Gunnery Sergeant." The two stepped away from the formation, and Pevensey coughed once more from the dust they stirred up. "It's been a few years, Master Gunnery Sergeant, since I've had to kick a Marine's ass," Pevensey said at last. Harrington glowered. "But if I ever hear you again referring to my yeoman as yeomanette or sailorette or anything else belittling of her station as a member of the United States Navy, you and I will find a private place to put our stripes and bars aside and resolve the question of whether I can still do it. Do we have an understanding?" Harrington set his jaw and his face flushed red. "Aye, aye, Captain," he said through clenched teeth. "Good," Pevensey nodded. "Now go do what you do best and lead your men. We've got a long hike ahead of us, and I'm sure there's worse in our future than what we've seen so far." The march took days, with several stops for water, as the masks did not completely prevent the accumulated dust from getting into their mouths and noses. The only positive thing was the sheer enormity of the tunnels, which made for easy progress, distance and darkness notwithstanding. "It must have taken them years to excavate something this large and this long," said Darling, looking up at the high roof of the tunnel. "Only a matter of weeks, actually, Chief," said Dorothy. "In less than a day for any of Roquat's army of whimsies, growlywogs, and phantasms to march the length of it." "Could I please get someone to tell me what the hell those things are, yeoman?" Harrington bit off the "et" he almost uttered. "Growlywogs are very large warriors who are almost all muscle," said Dorothy. "The tunnels were built to accommodate their bulk." Darling gave a low, appreciative whistle, taking in once again the enormity of the caverns. "Whimsies are just as big, but they have tiny little heads that they conceal with enormous tribal masks." "And phantasms?" asked Darling. Dorothy shuddered visibly. "Phantasms are the most evil. They're as large as the growlywogs, but they have the heads of animals. Goats, eagles, bulls, and the like." "More fairy tales," grumbled Harrington. "Sounds more to me like something out of St. John's Apocalypse," mused Pevensey. "Think we'll run into any?" said Darling, almost too keen on the prospect of an encounter. "Pray that we don't," said Dorothy, as they put on their masks and resumed marching toward Oz. The sun was high in the sky when the ground exploded just outside the royal palace of Oz. The impact of the grenades behind the explosion sent a geyser of rock and dirt into the air, sending unsuspecting Ozites scrambling in all directions. From the freshly made exit, the Marines spilled forth, forming a tight perimeter around the crater, through which the rest climbed out. Just as Dorothy had told them they would, they arrived outside the palace on the far side of a fountain. The fountain had a golden basin full of clear, cool water that tempted the Marines with the wet promise of washing the dust from their throats. Beneath the basin hung a simple sign: "All persons are forbidden to drink at this fountain." Despite the warning, several of them eyed the basin, thoughts of filling their canteens so obvious that they may as well have been stamped on their foreheads. "Nobody touch the water," said Darling. "You heard him," barked Harrington. Don't trust any native resources. Stick to your rations. Like the Tree of Eden, said Pevensey, looking up at the most beautiful fountain and its warning. Temptation always seems to sit out in the open at the most convenient times. Dorothy nodded. One drink of the waters of oblivion causes complete and permanent amnesia, she said. A steep price for a moment's refreshment. Overhearing Dorothy's warning, Harrington positioned himself between the fountain and the men, carefully opening his canteen behind his back and filling it from the fountain's overflow, while everyone's attention was drawn to the rush of Ozite guards, which suddenly began pouring through the gates of the palace. The Marines snapped their rifles to bear, then lowered their aim when they realized how small the guards were. The Royal Guards were uniformed in shimmering green and wore Beefeater-style helmets emblazoned with a stylized letter O. Despite their almost comical appearance, there was nothing humorous about the bayonets they carried, which they leveled at the Marines, or, more precisely, given the Ozite stature, leveled at a part of the Marines that was far more disconcerting. Before Dorothy could announce herself, there was another outburst from the palace, as a gentleman dressed in a finely tailored suit, green of course, ran through the door shouting, "Hold your fire! Hold your fire!" It took Dorothy a moment to recognize the fellow who so limberly ran toward them, even though she saw the bits of straw flying in his wake, for he was dressed in the most resplendent of clothing, a far cry from the workman's tatters he wore when she last saw him. "Scarecrow!" she cried, running to greet him. "What's this? What's this?" he cried. "Have we met? Scarecrow, don't you remember me? Has it been so long?" The Scarecrow stopped, drew himself up, and looked her over. "Dorothy, you've come back," he whispered, and trembled. Then shook himself, and his demeanor replaced quickly with one of joy. "I mean, Dorothy, you come back!" The whisper went through the Ozite guard. "Dorothy, she's back. Princess Dorothy." "Scarecrow," said Dorothy, "I'm so glad to see you. You look so regal." As soon as she said it, she realized something was very wrong. She gestured to her fellow soldiers. "My friends and I are on a very important mission," she said. "It's urgent we see Ozma right away." The Scarecrow started to speak, stopped, then smiled sadly. "Of course," he said. "Right away. Come." The Ozite guard parted around him, and he beckoned Dorothy to follow. She fell in step behind him, and the Marines quickly formed up behind her. No one saw Gunnery Sergeant Harrington cap off his canteen, now filled with the water of oblivion, as he brought up the rear. "I feel I should warn you," said the Scarecrow, as the party was ushered through the royal halls. "Princess Ozma has not been herself for some time now." "I feared as much," said Dorothy. "Has she taken ill?" "Yes. No, not as much," said the Scarecrow. "She has had an unfortunate incident that's left her unable to rule without assistance. You see, some years ago, Princess Ozma had an encounter with a young girl who was selling lemonade. Ozma, being Ozma, and you know how that is, or was, stopped to help the girl by purchasing a glass. But what she did not realize was that the girl, quite innocently of course, had filled her pitchers from the waters from the forbidden fountain." "Oh no," said Dorothy. "Oh yes," said the Scarecrow sadly. "Ozma lost all her memories instantly, and wandered about for days until the royal cabinet found her and brought her back to the palace. There was quite a to-do about to do. And what did they do?" The Scarecrow sighed. "There was only one other person in all the land they could find who had prior experience running Emerald City." Realization dawned on Dorothy. "And that was you," she said. The Scarecrow nodded. "And that was me," he said. "I left my farm in Winky Country to serve as a sort of advisor to the princess. But what could I do? They needed me in my brain, which, if I were to be honest, wasn't being exercised all that much by farming." He looked wistful. "I had actually begun to miss palace life, so I was awfully glad the opportunity to return had presented itself. Not that I'd have wished such a thing upon the princess, mind you," he added quickly. "Of course not," said Dorothy. "So that's why she hasn't returned me to Oz with Roquat's belt," she added. "She's forgotten about me." "I'm afraid so," said the Scarecrow. "And I suppose I've just been so busy helping her rule and everything that time just got away from me, else I would have remembered to remind her. But I'll remind her right now, and with you in person. Ah, here we are." They stepped through the emerald-encrusted archway that opened to the royal court. Ozma didn't sit upon the throne so much as she slumped in it. She was older than Dorothy remembered, which was to be expected, but her beauty had only increased. There was a quality to her that seemed as though she were in that state of just having been woke up for the day. Her eyes looked tired, and she reached for an empty glass that sat on a small table beside her throne. With a gesture from the Scarecrow, two Ozite girls in green gauze dresses helped Ozma sit up straight, while a third took the glass from the table, put it on a tiny tray she carried, and hurried it from the room. "Your Majesty," said the Scarecrow, bowing low as only he could. Ozma blinked. "Who are you?" she asked. "Why, it is I, your trusted advisor and Grand Vizier, Scarecrow," he said. Ozma looked to one of the girls propping her up, who nodded her assurance. "And I brought an old friend." Dorothy curtsied, while the rest stood at attention in formation behind her. "It is good to see you again, Your Majesty." "And you," Ozma said with an uncertain smile. She glanced over at the Scarecrow, who had taken up a position at her right hand. He whispered into her ear. "Princess Dorothy," she finished, "it is good to see you. It's been far too long?" She looked questioningly at Scarecrow again, who nodded. "Yes, far too long." "I am so sorry to hear what has happened to you," said Dorothy. "It is fortunate that you have such a good friend in the Scarecrow to help you." Ozma's face flickered with momentary confusion. "Yes, it is fortunate," she said. "But what—" The Scarecrow interrupted her train of thought with some more whispered comments, and Ozma nodded. "I mean, you've come a long way for this audience. How can I be of assistance to you?" "As you can see, Your Majesty, I haven't come alone," Dorothy said, indicating the Marines with her. "I have a pressing need that requires your help." "Of course," Ozma said. "Anything you need." The Scarecrow moved to advise Ozma again, but not before she finished. "Will be made available to you. You simply need to ask." "I do wish I could share pleasantries with you, but we are in something of a hurry," said Dorothy apologetically. "Our needs are relatively simple. We need a large wooden box, as big as a small room, with a rail fence built around the top of it. We'll also need 100 palm tree leaves." "Done and done," Ozma said, smiling at being able to make such a simple decision without advice. "Is that all?" "Well, Your Majesty," said Dorothy, "there is one other small thing." Before evening set, a number of Ozite carpenters had constructed what Dorothy had described, which ended up looking something like a cross between a highly magnified shipping crate and a scaled-down model of Noah's Ark. It was a simple cube, several feet high, with a wooden railing around the top and a hinged door set into one side of it. Mounted along two opposite walls were 50 hinged slots, into which the stems of the palm leaves were being inserted. When it was completed, 2 squads from the platoon, plus Gunnery Sergeant Harrington and Master Chief Darling, climbed ladders built onto the sides and stood atop it. So am I clear to know exactly what the plan is this time?" Harrington asked Darling. "Now that all this good lumber has been wasted?" Darling grinned mischievously. "I believe they sprinkle it with magic dust," he said, "and then we fly." Harrington snorted. "Right, fly. Sure, why didn't I think of that?" He patted the canteen. "Well, just so this mission isn't a complete bust, I've got a little something to bring back to the brass they can actually use." "What do you mean?" asked Darling. "I don't know exactly what kind of chemical they have in that fountain," said Harrington, "but if it works the way they claim it does, I bet our scientists can duplicate it and put it to work for our side. So I procured a little sample." Darling looked at the canteen, then at Harrington, who almost seemed to dare the chief to bawl him out about it. But Darling only nodded. "That's actually a good plan, Gunny," he said, "but keep it under your hat. I have a feeling we'll need every advantage we can get very soon." There was a commotion below of voices, too muddled for the men topside to clearly make out, as more Ozites arrived carrying a mounted hunting trophy. "Really, I thought I was in retirement, you know," said the mounted head. "I'm not at all eager to—" "Good heavens, you want to remake me into that?" "Hello, Gump," said Dorothy to her old friend. The wide-eyed creature craned its neck to look at her. "Dorothy!" it exclaimed. "You're back! But what's all this?" "I'm so sorry, Gump," she said. The remaining squad of Marines watched on with stupefied expression at the bodiless beast conversing with the yeoman. "Your princess has a great need of you. Will you help me this one last time?" The Gump turned toward the large contraption, then back at Dorothy and sighed. "I don't know that I can," it said tiredly, "but for you, I will certainly give it my best attempt." Dorothy kissed the Gump on its snout. "Thank you, Gump. That's all I could ask for. The Ozite set a ladder against the front of the crate, then took the gump and nailed its plaque high and centered against the face of the crate, where it stuck out like the figurehead of an old sailing ship. Princess Ozma, the Scarecrow at her side, strode into the courtyard. "Oh, Dorothy," she cried, looking much more alert than she did earlier, "I've the most wonderful news. I have a wishing belt that can send you anywhere you wish to go. There's no need for this extra work." "That's right, Dorothy," said the Scarecrow. "We can put the gump back on the wall, and your friends can make the trip in a trice. Of course, we'd need to know exactly where it is they're going. I don't believe you said." "Ah," said Dorothy. "Well, that's because we don't know exactly where to go." "No?" asked the Scarecrow. "Won't that make it difficult to know when you've arrived?" "Well, we have a general idea," Dorothy said. "Only general. And besides," she added to Ozma, "this will give my friends an opportunity to see more of the wonderful places in Oz." "That's a very good point," said Ozma cheerily. The Scarecrow seemed less convinced, but stayed silent. "In that case, here's the powder of life you requested." She handed Dorothy a small bag tied with string. Dorothy held the bag in her palm, feeling the weight of the magical dust. "Thank you," she said at last. "I suppose I should send them on their way then." She pulled herself away from her friends with reluctance and climbed the ladder to where the gump was mounted. Then she opened the bag and tossed a handful of the powder of life up and over the top of the railing. The crate groaned, and the palm fronds began to quiver. "Oh my," said the gump. "I feel so big." Dorothy stroked its muzzle. "Take them north, please, Gump," she spoke softly. "Into Gillikin country, to the great forest. Set down near Galet's castle and bring them back safely." The Gump tilted his neck forward. "But you told Ozma you didn't know exactly where you were going," Dorothy thought. "Yes," she said, "but with Ozma's condition, I thought she might not remember where Galet's castle was." She looked away as she spoke. "I didn't want to cause her any embarrassment." "Oh, that was very kind of you," said the Gump. "Yes," said Dorothy. "Yes, kind. Please do take care, Gump." Stroking his muzzle once more, she descended the ladder, which was then pulled away. The palm fronds began to wave in earnest, kicking up a great wind and blowing away the hats of many of the Ozites in attendance. With a strain, the great crate, the newly formed gigantic Gump, lifted into the air. It circled the palace grounds until it was high enough to clear the wall surrounding Emerald City, then angled north. "What the hell?" shouted Harrington, clasping his cover to his head with one hand and grabbing the rail with the other. "What kind of engine did they hook up to this thing?" "Just hold on," Darling yelled back over the wind. The several Marines on board strapped themselves in their gear to the wooden rail, and the green meadows of Oz passing beneath them soon gave way to rolling hues of lilac and lavender. "It must be some adventure they expect," said the Scarecrow to Oz, watching the speck of the Gump disappear in the distance, "to have need of so many. Why, back in the old days, it only took you and me, the lion, and our dear friend Nick Chopper to face down anything that came our way." He turned his gaze to Dorothy. "Just the four of us then," he said, and Dorothy thought she detected a note of wistfulness in the Scarecrow's voice. "Imagine what we might have accomplished with a group of friends as large as you have now." The next several days were spent in relative peace. Dorothy found her old room in the palace to be just as she had left it. Captain Pevensey and remaining men were free to wander about Emerald City, interacting with the Ozites and bartering items for souvenirs. Pevensey insisted that any acquired items be brought to him first, in case they possessed any magical properties which might benefit the Navy, but mostly the items had only mundane uses, even if their craftsmanship veered toward the exotic. Of course, since most of the artisan pieces included large-cut emeralds as part of their aesthetic, the men were careful to ensure they didn't pick up anything with a magical side effect to ensure they could keep their acquisitions. For her own part, Dorothy enjoyed the opportunity to chat with her old friends. Both of them, for Princess Ozma and the Scarecrow, never seemed to be apart, except for those times when Dorothy was alone with the Scarecrow. Once Dorothy awoke late into the night and went for a walk inside the palace to collect her thoughts. Coming upon Ozma's quarters, she was surprised to find standing sentry the Scarecrow himself. "Government never sleeps," he said brightly but quietly, "and neither do I. You never know when an emergency matter of state might crop up in the middle of the night, and Ozma would need my advice." Dorothy found herself agreeing with him and choked up at the deep devotion he displayed to their mutual friend. "It's going to take more than an army of girls to topple the monarchy this time," she heard him say as she made her way back to her own bedchamber. On the morning of the 6th day since their departure, the Ozite guard sounded the alert that the Gump had been spotted. Everyone ran outside, and soon Dorothy saw the returning party. The Gump's course was erratic, faltering even as it made its way with fits and jerks toward the palace grounds, settling violently to the ground. Within moments, Marines began scrambling over the sides. Dorothy glanced at Captain Pevensey and saw she shared the same concern. There were fewer men than had left, and of those returning, many were bandaged and wounded. Master Chief Darling himself wore a bloody rag around his right hand, or rather around the place where Dorothy knew his hand ought to be. Seeing them, Darling hurriedly staggered their direction. With his good hand, he reached up and tugged his cover tightly to his head. Just beneath the brim, Dorothy could see a bit of gold fabric peeking out, the facet of an embedded jewel catching the sunlight before he clumsily got it tucked away from view. Pevensey had seen this as well, and attempted to balance his excitement with his concern for the men. "Are you all right, Chief?" he asked, though his eyes conveyed a different question. Despite what had to be terrible pain, Master Chief Darling managed a half smile and a nod. "I'll be fine, Captain," he said. "Always wanted a Purple Heart." He turned to Dorothy. "The Gump," he said. "He'll be thirsty." Dorothy looked at the Chief quizzically, noting his emphasis. You need to get to him right away and give him a drink, Yeoman Gale. From this canteen," he said, patting the extra canteen hanging from his kit. "Hurry," he added, low but with a panicked intensity. Dorothy thought she understood. "Aye, Chief," she said, taking the canteen. As two Ozites placed a ladder at the fore of the Gump's crate, she shouldered past them and sprinted up the rungs before anyone else could make the climb. The Gump was hysterical. Its eyes were bulged and rolled in their sockets. Its nostrils flared. Its muzzle was flecked with froth, and it started when Dorothy suddenly appeared beside it, quite out of breath herself. "Oh, Dorothy!" he cried. "It was horrible! Horrible!" The creature's neck contorted and it shivered. "Your friends! Oh, those guns they carried! They're actually loaded! And so loud! And, oh, the blood! So much blood!" Its bleeding voice grew raspy, and its large brown eyes welled with fresh tears. "So much blood!" "Poor Gump," said Dorothy. "You didn't ask for any of this." She pet its forehead and worked open the canteen. "Here," she said. "Drink. You'll feel better." "Why did they make them all get in there? Why? They weren't a bother to..." The Gump sputtered as Dorothy held the canteen to its muzzle and tipped it back, allowing the water of oblivion to pour into its mouth. Dorothy had no idea whether the Gump, being really no more than just a head, would drink anything at all, but within moments of its messily lapping at the pouring water, it looked up at her with bewilderment. "What's going on?" it asked. "Who are you?" "Who am I, for that matter?" "You're the Gump," Dorothy said soothingly, "and soon you'll be back where you want to be most, hanging on your favorite wall in the palace." "What's going on up there?" a voice called from below. It was the Scarecrow, standing at the base of the ladder and looking very distressed. "Is the Gump all right? Everyone seems to be hurt down here, and what's making all the noise inside the crate?" Dorothy pried and pried at the Gump's plaque with her fingers until it came loose, then carefully carried it down. "It's fine," Dorothy said, passing the Gump's mounted head over to the Scarecrow, "but it's a mite shook up. I think once it's back in the palace, it'll feel so much better." Spying Ozma, Dorothy rushed past the flustered Scarecrow and over to the equally flustered Princess. "Dorothy, is everyone unharmed?" the Princess asked. "There's such disarray." Before Dorothy could speak, Captain Pevensey appeared beside her. "We're done here, Gale," he said. "How quickly can you get us back to the bomb?" Dorothy looked back at the crate and saw that a tight perimeter of men had been formed around it. The crate shook a bit from its ever-shifting contents, and for the first time Dorothy realized just how large a thing it was. She had only planned for the Gump, which she had assumed would be able to fly them all back to Ev once the extraction mission had been completed, but in its current condition, that wasn't going to happen. She turned to Ozma and brightened when she saw the Princess was wearing around her middle Roquat's belt. "Oh, Ozma, you're just in time to help us the most." Ozma, glad of being needed, was quick to cheer. "Of course, Dorothy, anything you ask. I'd like you to use Roquat's belt to wish that crate, the men around it, and Captain Pevensey and myself to the shores of Ev, just to the north of the border of Rinky-Tink," she said. "Can you remember all of that?" "I think so," she said with a nod. "Best if we're done now," said Pevensey. "Time is crucial." Dorothy gave Ozma a quick hug. I do hope you'll remember me, she said, and bring me back to visit you again. But of course I will, said Ozma. I'll look in on you often and bring you back to Oz as much as you like. Breaking their embrace reluctantly, Dorothy joined Captain Pevensey and the others around the crate. Goodbye, she waved. Then she closed her eyes as Ozma began to wish them away. She had a momentary fear as she wondered if Roquat's belt would even work if Ozma couldn't picture Ev in her mind. But a wink and a quarter later, her concerns were allayed. The magic of the belt was apparently strong enough to rely on words alone, for when she opened her eyes, the shores of Ev, the bomb repaired out to sea, filled her vision. As the Scarecrow returned from the palace, he saw Ozma using Roquat's belt, and only just caught sight of Dorothy and the soldiers and sailors disappearing, along with the enormous wooden crate. Where are they going? The Scarecrow asked. Things were happening much too fast for his liking. Where did they take that crate? And what did they have in it? Ozma smiled. Have no fear, Scarecrow, she said. Our friends had to leave in a hurry, but I've assured Dorothy I'll bring her back to Oz very soon. I see, said the Scarecrow. He cut his eyes to one of the attending Ozites and nodded curtly. Almost immediately she returned, bearing a silver tray, a pair of goblets, and a pitcher of cold water. Ah, me, said the Scarecrow airily. I do hate goodbyes, but let us toast to Dorothy's quick return. As he spoke, he filled both goblets, handing one to Ozma. To Princess Dorothy's quick return, she said, and she drank. And to... She blinked. What is all this? She looked around the grounds, then a Scarecrow. Who are you? Who am I, for that matter? Who are you? Asked the Scarecrow. Why, you're Princess Ozma, ruler of all the land of Oz, and me, he bowed low. I'm your trusted advisor and Grand Vizier, Scarecrow. With Captain Pevensey's permission, Dorothy spent the better part of the voyage home confined to quarters. Sleep did not come easily to her, knowing that somewhere deep in the hold of the bomb sat a little bit of Oz, imprisoned in the darkness of a large wooden crate. It was officially spring, but there was a bit of a chill wind blowing around the Washington Mall that day. Dorothy held her pea coat close about her as she sat on a bench and stared up at the nearly completed memorial tribute to Abraham Lincoln, its alabaster columns as white as the sky, where a low cloud cover veiled the sun. Penny for your thoughts, yeoman. Chief Darling had snuck up beside her bench without hearing her. Despite the ordeal, he still carried an air of boyish optimism and adventure around him. On the stub of his right arm, he wore a silver hook. Dorothy realized she hadn't spoken with the Master Chief in length since they had left Ev, what with much of his time being spent in the infirmary and Dorothy's own self-imposed exile on ship. How did it all happen? She finally asked. When you came to the great forest and found them. Darling sat beside her and sighed. You sure you want to hear this, yeoman? She nodded. Darling sat silent for a moment, then acquiesced. All right, you of all people deserve to know. You know, I volunteered to go on this extraction, he started. Insisted, actually. There was no way I could pass up an opportunity like that, could I? Remember I said I'd give my right arm? He chuckled humorously and looked at the hook. Be careful what you wish for, eh? But when would I ever have an opportunity to explore a fairy tale world, right? And besides, those instructions you gave to work the charm, well, you can imagine the gunny followed through with them. Darling shook his head sadly. Too much the realist, the gunny was. Not enough imagination. Anyway, he continued, we didn't so much as find them as they found us. Finding the castle was easy enough, and we made camp there for a few days before they came out of the forest and met with us. They were wary, naturally, but I dropped your name and they agreed to take us into their territory to speak with their king. I think that's when things sunk in for the gunny. I don't think he'd said 3 words from the time we landed until we met with the king. Harrington was always a hard-ass cynic, but he couldn't dismiss a civilization of talking winged monkeys. His mind couldn't process it. When we finally came to the Monkey King's palace, he snapped. Dorothy closed her eyes, picturing the carnage that must have followed. Harrington pulled his weapon and began firing on the damn dirty apes. Sorry, his words. The monkeys returned the attack and all hell began to break loose. Harrington was screaming. I don't know what exactly, but he was firing wild. I saw him go down. Darling gave Dorothy a hard look and continued, and she gave no indication to stop. There are all kinds of monkeys, you know, Darling said. I hadn't considered it when we went searching, but it seemed natural once I met them. I mean, they're all kinds of people, right? Just from what I saw, there were winged capuchins, mandrills, baboons. You get the idea. Well, while Gunny was screaming, a pair of flying marmosets zipped around his head. Tiny little things, and they forced their way into his mouth. I can only imagine them clawing their way down his throat and into his gut. By the time he went to the ground dead, they had burst through his backside of his pants, covered in his insides. The monkeys just scraped it off their fur and flung it at us before rejoining the attack. Looking back, we probably wouldn't have succeeded without Harrington's losing it, said Darling. While everyone else tried to kill each other, I slipped past the throne to the cap. They kept it right there. Can you believe that? Under a little glass dome on a pedestal, just like a museum piece. After that, I just did what you said. Although it wasn't quite as easy as I'm making out, he added with a rueful grin, holding up the stump of his arm. Inside the Capitol, Congress came to a rapid hush as President Wilson took to the podium. Behind him were seated a handful of high-ranking military advisors, including a beaming Rear Admiral Charles Little. Off to one loomed a large wooden crate. Gentlemen of the Congress, he intoned, I have called the Congress into extraordinary session because there are serious, very serious choices of policy to be made, and made immediately, which it was neither right nor constitutionally permissible that I should assume the responsibility of making. Although all assembled realized the intent of Wilson's message, his opening address underscored just how sobering the situation was, and was about to become. On the 3rd of February last, he continued, I officially laid before you the extraordinary announcement of the Imperial German government that on and after the 1st day of February, it was its intent to put aside all restraints of law or of humanity and use its Nibelung squadrons of Valkyries to bring to ground every aircraft that sought to approach either the shores of Great Britain and Ireland or the western coasts of Europe, or any of the ports controlled by the enemies of Germany within the Mediterranean. Admiral Little nodded as he listened. They were all aware of the military advantage the Germans had obtained over their surrounding neighbors. These armored women on winged horseback could outmaneuver any aircraft launched by man, cutting fuel lines and literally flying circles around pilots. And while the Brits had shocked the world with the unveiling of their grotesque deck regiment, homunculi playing card soldiers, the regiment was only useful on land and barely did more than give the enemy a momentary fright before the largely paper constructions proved more than destructible. But with the United States entering the war, things were about to change. Little looked up. President Wilson had just announced the U.S. would indeed answer the call and go to war. Then, before all assembled, Wilson took up a small golden cap, a beanie really, encrusted with jewels, and placed it on his head. He stood on his left foot. Epe, pepe, kake, he said, to the confusion of many. He switched to his right foot. Hillo, hollo, hello. Out on the mall, a growing shadow blotted out what sunlight filtered through the clouds. Yeoman Gale and Master Chief Darling both turned their gaze to the sky, where a great cloud of winged monkeys amassed it before flocking eastward. And a zizzy, zizzy, zick, Darling said softly. Those those Valkyries won't know what hit them. Dorothy watched as the monkeys flew away on a journey that would take them thousands of miles over the Atlantic, where they would engage in deadly combat with the German Valkyries. The clouds relented just a bit, and as Dorothy watched the last of the monkeys become black pinpricks above the horizon, a sliver of sunlight refracted through the misty sky in a ribbon of brilliant colors. Because I couldn't say somewhere over the rainbow without inflicting copyright infringement on everyone involved. So, that was an interesting nearly an hour. Honestly, didn't know if I was going to get to read some of it or all of it. That was all of it. That was the top secret military extraction effort of Oz by me, collected in the short story anthology Strange Imaginings from Amazon. You can find that and other works by me under my Amazon author page. You can find the Destroyer books that I write, starring Remo Williams. Went through the whole thing without a drink. We did not have any takers on the open mic night tonight, which is okay. It's going to happen. We will just do another one sometime, and maybe we'll have better luck. Maybe Tuesday nights is not a good night for open mic night. or maybe somebody is just running a massive stream somewhere else that everyone else is attending to. Whatever, we're always glad to come online and talk with you. For those enjoying the replay, again, we are working our way to 1,000 subscribers. We are just short of 30 from reaching that goal. So we greatly appreciate if you enjoy the content we're putting here, the interviews that we do, the live readings that we do. Please hit that subscribe button and hit the bell for notifications so you don't miss notices that we're getting ready to go live with something unannounced like an open mic night. So with that said, I bid you fond farewell. Auf Wiedersehen. Good night. And we will see you again Thursday when we have John Della Rose on, unless we get somebody scheduled for tomorrow night, which is always a possibility. If you have a comic, a movie, a book, a music CD that you want to get out here and promote, hit us up in the DMs on Twitter at Critical Blast, or you can email us at criticalblast@criticalblast.com. Good night.